Let me say a few words, first of all, about His Excellency Ambassador Andras Simonyi. Ambassador Simonyi was born in 1952 in Budapest. As a child, he witnessed the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. He moved with his family to Denmark for 5 years as a boy, where he learned English and Danish fluently. Ambassador Simonyi majored in transport economics at the Karl Marx University of Economics in Budapest, graduating in 1975, writing his thesis on Denmark's security policy in the 20th century. Ambassador Simonyi has worked with numerous youth organizations, such as the State Committee for Youth, the Bureau of the World Federation for Democratic Youth, which is his frontline organization, speaking out on the imperialist practices of capitalist countries and of NATO. Here he's laid a special focus on creating links between East and West. In the 80s, he also worked for the Socialist Workers' Party in Hungary in the Foreign Relations Departments. From 2002 until 2007, he served as the Hungarian ambassador to the United States, where he actually became quite famous in the US as well as in Hungary, where he really was actually practicing cultural diplomacy. One of the things, there are many secrets I guess I can tell, but he actually started a band in Washington called Coalition of the Willing, where they would actually perform. In addition to live performances, he was also on the Colbert Review, or Colbert Report, many of the big TV shows. Not typical for a Hungarian ambassador in the US, and that sense really was able to use culture quite effectively in also the modern setting. Ambassador Simonyi is a firm believer in music as a mediator for cultural diplomacy. He's expressed his opinion in the past that rock and roll was a key factor to loosening the tight totalitarian grip behind the Iron Curtain. He has also made a number of appearances, as I said, the Colbert Report, a satirical political show on the American cable TV. In addition to his numerous obligations, Ambassador Simonyi, I'm proud to say, is a very active member of the advisory board of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. We've worked together in the United States and Germany, around the world, and I'm really grateful to your friendship and also your partnership here at ICD. I'm also grateful that you've introduced me to Markos Kounalakis, who is the president and publisher emeritus of the Washington Monthly magazine. Mr. Kounalakis initially received his BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, in 1978. Received then his MSc in journalism from Columbia University, where I also studied, in 1988. Was also a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow in Europe from 1988 to 1989, as well as an International Journalism Graduate Fellow at the University of Southern California from 1995 until 1996. He worked as at the NBC Radio with Mutual News Moscow correspondent and covered the fall of the Soviet Union as well as the war in Afghanistan. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times Magazine, International Herald Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, and many other regional and international newspapers and magazines. He currently serves on the Board of Visitors at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, Board of Advisors at Georgetown College, as well as the Wilson Council at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Center's Board of Advisors for Southeast Europe Project. He's written many books, I'll mention a few, Defying Gravity, The Making of Newton, Beyond Spin, The Power of Strategic Corporate Journalism, and Hope is a Tattering Flag, Voices of Reason and Change for the Post-Bush Era. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a joint presentation from Ambassador Andras Simonyi and Mr. Markos Kounalakis. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back in Berlin, in a new Berlin. And we've had a great morning session, and you clearly have a broad understanding of the issues of cultural diplomacy. But what Ambassador Simonyi and I would like to present is a framework that we're working on, and have developed, which is called Spectral Power. And the way that we like to illustrate Spectral Power is as follows. I'm going to pull up our presentation and start. And let me go full screen here. There we go. So, drücken Sie die Escape-Taste. Nein. Okay, I'm going to start where we're going to start. So, as you heard, I am from San Francisco, which is a city perhaps known for its different values in the 60s. It was a progressive place, and this is kind of what it looked like back then. It was a very free place. And Ambassador Simonyi came from elsewhere.
Yeah, just compare the two. I come from Budapest, and this is my city in the 60s, and you might see the difference between the two. It's the same time, basically the same music too, but what a difference. And that having been said, I just want to make sure that the reason for why we're standing here together is because despite the different backgrounds and different cultural experiences, there was one substantial common experience, and that was the rock beat culture of the 60s that really is the starting point of our lecture. The difference between the two really is that while not Markos, but while his friends were smoking pot, we were just dreaming. We were just dreaming of smoking pot. But you know, the fact is that the amazing thing about all this is that this culture broke through barriers, and there's no better place to explain this than exactly in Berlin, where you have the wall a couple of 100 meters from here that was supposed to have stopped rock and roll music from infiltrating the East, and it couldn't.
That's right. So my reality was a very colorful reality. It was a very musical reality. It was a lively reality. It was a reality full of revolution and of change. And of course, when we looked over the border, we sometimes, when we were within our Cold War context, would look at Andras' reality.
Yeah, it was interesting because we took to the hills of Budapest with our Bakelite radio and listened to rock and roll music broadcast by Radio Luxembourg, Radio Free Europe. So, in a sense, technology came to our assistance, and that is really why, while the authorities tried to stop this culture, this so-called destructive Western culture from infiltrating Eastern Europe, they just couldn't.
But back then, as you can see, the one thing that could cross over those borders, those walls, those fences, was in fact the music. But there were really, what was true back then was there were two effective technologies that could cross over borders. Everything else was impenetrable, it was impermeable. And one of them were missiles that could go over borders, and the other was radio waves. And that was how a state maintained its monopoly over power. So, as I say, one was military, the other was music in essence, and if I can get this to work, you can see where Andras fell into that. That's what unified us, were these realities. And in essence, were these artists of the time. But we are now in a very new era. And the monopoly of power, as we've heard so many times before, and the monopoly of the technologies, not just the tools, not the bombs and the radios, but the content, which means the thing that is important to be delivered. The delivery mechanisms have changed, and the tools have changed. All of you know it. You've got tools in your pocket that right now have much more power than we could have imagined. I mean, as one friend of mine is happy to say, you've got more computing power in your mobile telephone that was in the entire moon launch in 1969 on that capsule.
But also, don't forget, way back then the world was relatively simple. Everything was black and white. You were either living in the free West or you were living in Eastern Europe, and that has changed. That has changed immensely. So you have to understand that while way back then the relatively simple tools of delivery, as Markos explained, one in the military field, the other in the cultural field, was relatively simple. You had radio, or you had nothing, or you had tape recorders, record players, but basically it was simple technology. Also, in terms of military technology, relatively simple. It was the nuclear, it was the ballistic missiles, it was the short-range missiles. But it was relatively easy to understand. Today, it's far more complicated.
And this is where we come up with our concept of spectral power, which is to say that when back then you looked at a black and white world, you had black and white tools. They were very simple, as Andras says. But today, the complexity of the world, the types of things that Professor Kull talked about this morning, which says that you have non-state actors, you have state actors operating in different ways, you have corporate actors acting differently. It's created any number of people-to-people opportunities, corporate-to-people opportunities, but the way that we need to look at this is what we have worked on dominantly, which is this idea of how do you look at the tools available to you and the delivery mechanisms available to you within a spectrum, not simply on or off, black or white, but within a full color spectrum. And of course, with a spectrum, you have things that are visible and you have things that are invisible. For us, the visible spectrum represents that which is often done by the state. The things that are invisible are the things that are done by non-state actors. So if you imagine a full color spectrum and then what goes on off to infrared and ultraviolet, if you think about what goes on in those invisible sectors, invisible to the eye, that is what essentially civil society, organizations, NGOs, and others are responsible for. But we'll step it back a few.
Okay, let's go back just for a second to, you saw a lot of rock and roll. You saw a lot of guitars. You saw a lot of pictures of a lot of bands, great bands, by the way. Not as good as my band, but they're great still. By the way, we are really very good. I do believe that rock and roll had much to do with the fall of communism because it was an ultimate tool to soften up society. Don't forget, it was not an elitist culture. Rock and roll, while of course the party central committees try to portray it as the invention of the West, something that is going to bring down the West. But basically, they never understood. This was really the first popular quality mass culture that was accessible to everyone. It was accessible to everyone to listen to, but interestingly enough, it was also accessible to everyone to practice it. More rock bands grew out of nowhere in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s than you had chamber orchestras throughout history together, and which means that this really was a very, very popular thing in the East and in the West. Now, I want to be very, very careful because I've told the story of rock and roll before to not the same audience, but at the same, on the same podium. Now, I want to be very careful that you do not misunderstand that what I'm telling you is not that rock and roll is what saves the world, and I don't believe rock and roll of today is what saves the world. Rock and roll in the past is not the rock and roll of today. So this brought us to a conclusion. Think about rock and roll as a metaphor. Don't think about it just as a musical form, just in a form of expression. Think about it as a metaphor. Metaphor, which means that each new generation have to invent their own rock and roll, quote unquote rock and roll. So what we are trying to say, or what we are saying, is the rock and roll of today is Facebook, Google, YouTube, because what you're talking about, mass culture, easily accessible, and which you can use to change society.
And it's not going to be limited to these particular representations that you see here. There are things that are going to be organic, that they're going to have revolutionary, they're going to be oftentimes groundbreaking. You're going to see them as disruptive, and disruptive in the largest sense, that they are not in and of themselves, you know, a Facebook page or a Google search page is not going to be what's effective. It's what, in fact, they enable, and whether or not you can use them in effective ways. So we've gone on there, and of course we've talked a great deal about Egypt this morning. This is one of my favorite photographs, by the way, is the fact that it says Egypt is a Tahrir Square photo. But of course, it's not just that rock and roll still does play a role. I mean, Lady Gaga, for example, in her message of tolerance and the like, is someone who is a cross-border musical talent who is actually having effect. But, as we heard this morning, the hip-hop groups of Egypt are as important, if not more important, to the indigenous groups of people who are going to be listening to that music and being affected by that music, but being able not just to produce, develop, but being able to distribute. And that's what the tools of today are going to be able to allow, is that distribution, and at times even the very production of it.
But it's, you have to understand that when we speak about this metaphoric rock and roll, what we're trying to say is that it becomes the real rock and roll when people or peoples in different countries, different regions, different cultures feel it's their own, that they have an ownership. So I want to make sure you understand I'm not trying to impose Western rock and roll music on any country, any culture. What I want to do is to make sure that if Western rock and roll music speaks to the individual, speaks to the culture, speaks to the region, speaks to the society, why not use it?
And that's exactly right. And so we've incorporated in this light, of course, all the other technologies that are so clear. The cell phone is perhaps the one singular most important technology, which is now a cross-border technology, which also allows for the types of distribution and information engagement in these regions. Now, of course, does that mean that this is obsolete?
No, of course not. We want to make sure you understand this whole concept, and really try to imagine a spectrum where you have hard power on the one end and you have soft power on the other end. You have hard power. This is hard power on one end. And then you have soft power, which is, well, cultural diplomacy, musical exchanges on the other end. But in between, there is a vast array of tools that can be described in different ways. Let's give an example about how the different tools make different sense in different situations. Can we pull up the Bruce Springsteen slide?
Sure.
You think?
Here we go.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say, you saw a box. This is a virtual box of power tools. Now, those power tools, we, through the spectral power concept, put into one box. So far, very little has been done to get the two sides of soft power and hard power together in one box, because in the end, it's all about power. But let me just explain to you why I asked Markos to pull up this slide. In 1988, Amnesty International came to Hungary with Bruce Springsteen and Sting and Tracy Chapman and Peter Gabriel, Yusundur. And they were part of an international tour to talk about human rights. And interestingly enough, the only country in the East where they came to was Hungary. Just imagine 20,000 people, maybe 30, in main stadium in Budapest. 1988, if anyone tells you that he or she foresaw the changes that were about to come in a year from 1988, that they knew it, and they're lying. Nobody knew. So it was a sensation that these guys came to Hungary. Just imagine Bruce Springsteen singing Born in the USA and 30,000 Hungarians screaming. Wonderful. And we were very, very pleased with this. And it really did have an impact. It had an impact on the way we thought about human rights. It had an impact on us, how we thought about rock and roll. But it also had a very positive impact on how we thought about the United States, about the West. Just imagine, and that's 1988. Just imagine, Bruce Springsteen is probably coming to Budapest next year.
We're hoping.
And next year or a year after. But anyway, there are plans. Bruce Springsteen coming to Budapest in 2012 or 2013 will hardly make a difference like that. It will be a great concert, but it will not be a life-changing, politically loaded event. So why is this important? Because the same tool in a different era, different time and place will have a totally different effect, impact. Like, for example, the New York Symphony coming to Budapest, wonderful, but it will hardly change the perception of the United States. The same symphony orchestra playing a concert in North Korea 2 years ago had an incredible impact on the elites of that country.
So we're looking at our full service toolbox here. And often, the reason we want to include this is because oftentimes when we're in an environment where we're talking about cultural diplomacy, where we're talking about the benefits of soft power, when we're trying to figure out how to use soft power and where it belongs and whether or not a state should be enabling of it or if it should be the purveyor of it, what you often don't have in the mix is the reality of the hard power aspect of it. And so when we put together our toolboxes and consider how it is we want to affect outcome in other nations or hope that other nations will affect their own outcomes, we have to be able to incorporate in very clear-eyed fashion the role that hard power plays as both a supporter of a state which is purveying the soft power tools, but also as, at times, the thing that prevents change from occurring within a state because of the elements of repression and the elements of policing and the military aspects. The reason we will continually talk about this within a full spectrum and a full mix within that spectrum is because you cannot divorce one without the other. You can have the greatest singers on earth in a country and they can all be in jail because if you have those powers of repression, it will not make a difference in how many songs of freedom they are singing, except over time. But sometimes we want to be able to fight that time.
I just want to come back to a question Markos put to me about hard power tools being totally obsolete. Of course, it's nonsense. We do need hard power in order to protect and in some situations in order to support. Like we needed hard power to help the revolution progress in Libya. And it's obvious that we will need hard power to fend off hard power, like, for example, defend ourselves against a possible attack from Iran. That needs hard power. Nobody will sing away nuclear missiles that are pointed at a country. But what we are saying is that that aspect of power, that aspect of the power toolbox has to be used much smarter, and that a greater proportion of our efforts have to be invested in a smart use of our soft power tools. It's not a trade-off, but I think it's in some situations it is a trade-off, and we just have to figure out how better to use the different tools in the different situations. And here I come to the most important aspect of our theory. It's about economics. It's basically economics. It's basically about the declining resources of our societies to use hard power. It is because of the declining appetite of our societies to use hard power. So in this situation, sensible politics, sensible policymakers are obliged to figure out how to fit the hard power and soft power tools better together.
And so when we talk about these hard power aspects, what you often hear within military circles is you don't want to fight the last war. So when you do policy planning and development for your military capacity, you try to change your strategy, you look at the technologies, you look at your resources, and you adjust. What we sometimes are lagging in, even though we have an understanding of it, certainly in this room, is the change in the soft power tools. We cannot fight the Cold War, as we've heard multiple times this morning, with the soft power tools of the Cold War in today's world. And so, so this is an important part of it. What Andras and I have hoped to do within this spectrum, and as you can see, we've used the color rainbow, is to understand how do we apply economic models and economic values to those soft power tools. It is a very difficult job. Trying to figure out a way to apply a value, for example, to the hip-hop music that was presented this morning in Egypt versus the cost of a tank is very, very difficult. But that is going to be the challenge if we are hoping, to affect the dialogue within the policy-making realm, because policymakers and politicians will respond to econometric arguments. It is very difficult for them to talk about the eventual changes that are brought on by cultural diplomatic means, or that music will eventually evolve. You need to have hard statistical metrics. And this is one of the most difficult things that we will have. In fact, one of the things that Professor Kull said this morning is that the short-term inability to deliver the return on investments, visible returns on investments in the cultural diplomacy field is one of the greatest challenges for being able to make arguments to our policymakers for increased investment in the cultural diplomacy field. And that's both within the international field and also domestically.
Now, we want to make sure that you understand, we want to be very careful. We're not selling easy fixes. And what we're not selling is advocating this solution versus the other solution. What we're advocating is that we have to figure out a way to calculate the costs and benefits of using either. Let me just put it this way. If you think soft power works under all circumstances, that's wrong. Sometimes we will come to conclusions that are not very nice. Sometimes we will come to a conclusion and say that, unfortunately, with all the goodwill and with all the popularity, we'd rather more suggest to use hard power in a given situation than soft power, because in the end, you want to achieve what you want to achieve. So that's a warning sign. We want to make sure that that there is a good understanding that we are not advocating easy fixes. One thing we do know, though, that so far we have not been smart enough in how we put together the model that will give an answer to the questions. And what we would like to do is figure out how we can prepare, in the end, a tool for policymakers to better use our resources.
And so we will, if I can go really quickly through our this is what we discussed earlier, and I'm just going to show you illustrations of the very same thing. If you can read that, you can't because it says tools. It goes from soft to hard. Delivery, soft to hard, the way that you delivered these tools. And then you incorporate our spectrum, red to blue, red being hard, blue being soft. This is on the delivery side, this is on the tool side, and then what happens when you cross these into a matrix? Well, if you look at the types of tools that we've talked about, the visible hard, this is a way to sort of provide a framework for you to look at the different types of tools. You'll notice, for instance, that on the invisible hard side, I have Al Jazeera. Well, some people will argue that it is used as a propaganda tool. It's something that, that is deployed, but it's just as easily used as an invisible soft tool if you imagine the role that Al Jazeera played in the Egyptian uprising. And then there are any number of other invisible soft tools. Remember, the invisible being the non-state and the visible being the state. Of course, Al Jazeera is also underwritten by a state, but nonetheless, it operates in the public mind as a non-state actor oftentimes. And I think the visible tools are rather clear. You'll even see that there's a non-state actor under the visible hard because sometimes NGOs and organizations, for instance in the case of Blackwater, are not seen as being independent of a state. They're actually being seen as a part of a state. So whether or not you are officially a part of the state doesn't necessarily define whether you are in the visible part of the spectrum. You can actually be underwritten by a state, and if the public mind says that you have a relationship to that state, then you are within the visible part of the spectrum. Same thing with Al Jazeera. If the perception is that you are not a part of a state, even though you are underwritten by a state, then it doesn't matter. You get to go into the invisible side of the category. So this is what happens when you cross the two. Yeah, sorry.
Can we go back?
Absolutely.
Just 1 second. Please understand that sometimes we're trying to figure out maybe to use different expressions because at times, calling Al Jazeera soft power is a misnomer. Because if you look at the impact, if you look at the way Al Jazeera scared the hell out of dictators, if you look at the way it has penetrated societies, it's very, very hard not to call it hard power in a sense. So therefore, we use these expressions in short of having invented new expressions. But the bottom line is that sometimes soft power tools can be really, really, really hard. And as a matter of fact, some hard power tools are very soft.
So if you cross these two, the delivery methods and the tools, then you get a matrix. And you can see what happens here is you essentially have the hard quadrant down here, which is often military. You have the hard-soft, which can be the military use for delivery of soft power tools. And we have the example of aircraft carriers delivering tsunami relief, for example. On the bottom right-hand corner, you have the hard soft power, which is a state often delivered declaration or a démarche. And then up in the upper right, in soft, you have often what's non-state, which is independent foundations, NGOs, helping with malaria aid and the like. And then we continue on to define the visible part of that spectrum. So exactly the same matrix, but really what is encompassed by the state. What you'll notice is, of course, the domination of the state within the hard quadrant of the spectrum, diminishing as you move on outside into 3 of the quadrants. Now, what I promised at the beginning of this lecture and what you saw in the description of what it was we were talking about is the acceleration of cultural diplomacy. And the acceleration is really, it can be simplified and put into very simple terms if you consider that this cloud, which is the state cloud, is in some ways diminishing, while the rest of this, with the arrows going out further, is expanding. This is the world that you live in when you start talking about cultural diplomacy, because the tools in delivery have expanded at such a logarithmic pace at this point that they are exponential at this point. And so it is very difficult to actually have enough room within this matrix, but this is the areas in which the opportunities for non-state actors exist.
I think this also poses a big just a comment on the last slide. It really what we're trying to say is that it is not anymore just a luxury to talk about these things, because the state will be forced to figure out how to use its own toolbox much better in a time when YouTube and Facebook and Twitter is not the last YouTube and Twitter you've seen, because the next Twitter is already out there, which will be an even greater challenge to the supremacy of state or the state monopoly on influencing those fields. So I would say that this net will be even shrinking.
And so I think we should sort of wrap it up here and probably go to some questions. Our goals are really to develop this further, to look at this, to provide a framework so that policymakers can understand it. We've tried to simplify it in many ways, and I think you've probably seen that we've done that simplification. We're hoping to apply econometric models to these matrices so that we can apply values to wherever you come into this, so that you can say, well, the Gates Foundation malaria costs X amount of money versus a different type of effect, that a different other type of tool and delivery system that gets delivered at a very different cost. And can we then apply our resources to that, maybe stop doing some things, do more of the other things. But we have to always look at it holistically. We have to look at specifically to each case. And we have to figure out the cost-effective nature of each new cultural diplomacy tool that's used versus those legacy cultural diplomacy tools. And we'll leave it at that, and we'll take some questions, unless you have something else, Andras.
Thank you.